So I'm going to show a bunch of my work, but I'm going to think about it in relation to the concept of public space. So it's something I've been doing for many years. I've been for many years doing a project called Model for a Public Space. And so I'm going to theme it around that. And I have a certain, I want to first, I guess, define public space. And I have a very specific definition of it. So my definition of public space is that public space is nothing but the demonstration of a paradox in the physical world. So I'm going to try to explain that, and then I'm going to explain my work through 6 different topologies of public space, 6 different common frameworks of public space, spatial frameworks. So I guess this is inspired by a couple of things. First of all, I think public space is very important today because it seems to be disappearing. Like, I don't know, I like to use a concept called neoliberalism. I don't know if that's a very familiar concept or not to you, but it's a way that many political theorists, geographers, critical thinkers like to think about the present period in terms of an economic and political moment. So neoliberalism refers to the liberalism of the 19th century, free market liberalism, as it's returned in the present. So neoliberalism means the privatization of things, apparently. And so public space is an interesting thing to think about in a moment when things are being apparently privatized. So I think it's important for us to think about public space as it seems to be maybe disappearing, a certain kind of public space. But also, recently, we've seen, I think, a reinvigoration of the idea of public space in terms of the demonstrations that occupied the world in, after the financial crisis, since 2010, in the Arab Spring, in Black Lives Matter, in the Quebec student movement, I think, was a really amazing example of the occupation of public space. So public space has become, I think, something very important to think about for these 2 reasons. On the one hand, it's disappearing. On the other hand, it's being reinvigorated by the practices of people engaging it. But public space is something that's very hard to really pin down. It seems like a very contradictory concept. It seems like the government produces public space, but then that's its own space of authority, and yet people make demonstrations, they produce public space. There are many different contradictions that are inherent to the term. So I'd like to try to make a definition that clarifies, for me, what public space is. So I want to return to Jürgen Habermas's 1962 book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, which is a very well-known text. But in it, he says, what is the public sphere? The public sphere is something which is separate from the realm of public authority and the private realm, the realm of the economy and the family. So the public sphere is a separate space. It's both maybe a physical space, could be a coffee shop, could be a public square, could be a newspaper, could be a television show, could be media, could be art, could be all kinds of things which are somehow separate from these other 2 realms and can therefore criticize them, therefore can create a discourse which is critical of the private realm and the space of public authority. So I'd like to think about public space in the same way. That is that there are essentially 2 kinds of spaces. There are 2 kinds of legal spaces in most countries. There's private property, legal private property, and there's legal state property. There's sovereign property. 2 different kinds of property. But what we might call public property, which would be the property of the state, is in Habermas's, if I kind of translate this topology of Habermas's, not about spheres or realms, but in terms of space itself, then spaces owned by the government are simply spaces of public authority. That is, they're spaces which are controlled by the government interest. They're not necessarily public sphere spaces, or they're not public in the sense that the public sphere is public. So I want to posit that public space, the concept of public space, should be reserved for a kind of space which is somehow at once separate from spaces of public authority and spaces of private property, and therefore can be a space which is explicitly critical of them and in dialogue with them. The only problem is that there are only two kinds of space. So public space has to be layered on top of one of the other two forms of space. There's no legal construction called public space in the sense that I'm thinking about it. It can only be the occupation of one of the other two kinds of space. So so this is complicated because there are clearly two kinds of public space here. There are spaces of public authority, and there are what I want to call public spaces. And obviously, our definitions of public space shift between these two categories all the time. But I want to reserve this third space that I'm calling public space for the concept of public space. So let's say that's the case. Hannah Arendt, who's another important theorist of public space, argues that the term public signifies two closely interrelated but not altogether identical phenomena. The first, it means that everything that appears in public can be seen and heard by everybody and has the widest possible publicity. So this corresponds closely to what she calls the space of appearance. That is, that publicness is just our appearing to one another. It's a very contingent idea. It's like I'm appearing maybe right now, but other people will appear at other moments. So it's a very contingent, somewhat temporary spatial idea. The second term, public, signifies the world itself, insofar as it is common to all of us and is distinguished from our own privately owned place within it. And I think this idea of the world itself maybe corresponds more closely to public space out there in the world. Hannah Arendt also talks later about the durability of publicness. So one of the things that the public does is it creates durable spaces. But at the same time, the space of appearance is very contingent. So I'm interested in the way, within Hannah Arendt's own discourse about public space, there's a paradox of durability and contingency. So I think her theory of public space is already paradoxical. But I want to go a little bit further. This is Boris Groys's book, The Communist Postscript. He makes a very interesting argument about the way in which capitalism has no interest in language. Capitalism has no interest in what people say or the arguments that they make, because all answers are provided by numbers. And so alongside this logic of numbers is what he calls a formal logic. So capitalism produces a coherent space that's ruled by numbers. And he posits this against the logic of communism, which is, in his mind, about language. It's an ideological problem, so it needs to be argued through. It needs to be spoken about somehow. And so for him, capitalism is a process of sophistry, while communism is a process of philosophy, and it contains within itself a paradoxical logic. That is, a logic of contradiction, whereas capitalism tries to contain within itself a logic of coherence, formal, logical space. So I'm interested in the way in which public space can be nothing but the emergence of a kind of paradox in physical space. So the kind of emergence of language and contradiction within the smooth space of capitalism. So that's a kind of theory of public space. I want to talk a little bit about the concrete space of the city. So again, I'm still going to talk in somewhat abstractions because I want to talk about general phenomena, but I want to talk about the neoliberal city. So Margaret Thatcher is one of the key theorists of neoliberalism, and she argues that there's no such thing as society. There are only individuals, men, women, and families. But what is the physical space of neoliberalism? So this is just really two iconic photographs of Toronto. One of them, which I would say is an important modernist and Fordist piece of the city, City Hall, and one which is a very typical, let's say, piece of the neoliberal city, which is simply a kind of postmodern condominium building, whose form is determined by its setbacks its ability to mimic, this historical building is mimicked by the new building. Then the tower sets back on top of it. So one of the things that neoliberal space does is it tries to create a kind of seamlessness in the urban fabric. I'm trying to illustrate the sophistry of the city, the way the city appears especially not to be a space of contradiction. So the logic of neoliberalism is to produce a city, a smooth city, a seamless city, which is free of contradictions. So the Urban Design Handbook, this is from a document from 1997 in Toronto, argues very strongly for the unity of the facades of buildings, the way in which they create continuities, they create alignments between existing buildings. So this is very simple, like postmodern urban design logic, but postmodern urban design tries to create the image of a coherent city. It tries to create the image of an affluent, coherent city. So it creates a certain kind of image, which is ideological, and it covers over the very real contradictions which exist in the city. So these are two maps of Toronto, one from 1960 and one from 2000, and they show average employment income. So middle incomes are in these two categories. So this is slightly above average income, and this is slightly below average income. This is 1.5 to 2.35 times average income, and this is half to 0.8 average income. And so you can see that the poorest areas of the city are in the downtown area, and the richest areas are in the kind of north center and in what's called Etobicoke. But this is the same city in 2000, and you can see that what's disappeared is the yellow and the light blue. So the areas which were closer to average income have disappeared from the city, and what has proliferated is the lower end, and what is also proliferated is the highest end in the center core of the city. So you can see processes of gentrification, but mostly what you see is an intense polarization of the city in terms of economic wealth between the Fordist period, or we could say Fordist Keynesian period of the mid-20th century, and the neoliberal post-Fordist moment of the turn of the millennium. So I guess this is very quick, but I'm interested in the ideological project of the city, which is to create its seamlessness, which covers over its true contradictory nature. And so how can public space, in a sense, public space is a project of revealing the contradictions of the city. So I've already mentioned that one of the reasons I'm interested in this is that recently there have been a set of movements which have brought those contradictions to light. So the Indignados movement in Spain would be one, anti-austerity protests in Athens, especially the Quebec student movement, I think is a really exemplary movement. These movements bring contradictions to light. So part of my argument is that it's not just that people say something in public space which might reveal a paradox, but that their physical occupation changes the space in such a way that the paradox is materially demonstrated, it's materially manifest. And so I think this is easy to see in the case of demonstrations, but there are lots of other ways in which public space can be made. It can be made by architects, it can be made by artists, I think, especially cultural workers can produce public spaces, which I think have similar kinds of effects. I mean, I think many artworks produce public spaces which manifest a paradox in the physical world. And so I'd like to talk about my own work in that sense. But also, I'll talk about this one piece that I did last year, Furnishing Positions, which tries to outline 6 common types of paradoxes. So if part of my argument is very broad, it's that every public space is simply the demonstration of a paradox. I think there are also very common paradoxes which public spaces represent. And so I'm going to work through these 6 common paradoxes. But that's what I tried to do with this project, which is called Furnishing Positions. So Furnishing Positions is a set of pieces of furniture which are 1/6 of a circle benches. So they're radiused benches, each of them 1/6 of a circle. There are 30 of them, and they work at different radiuses and at different heights. So they're not adjustable. They're unique pieces, but they can be moved into any configuration. So they were shown at the Blackwood Gallery. Christine Shaw curated it. And Furnishing Positions was both a sculpture and a newsletter, what we called a broadsheet. So the broadsheet furnished positions, intellectual positions, about 6 paradoxes of public space, while the sculpture was rearranged 6 times to create 6 different kinds of spaces within. It's at U of T Mississauga, so it's kind of a teaching environment. So different classes occupied the space. So this is actually just the opening. And then, so there were 6 different arrangements. This is the first arrangement, which just simply kind of puts 2 groups of people face to face in a somewhat confrontational space. The second one I'm more familiar with. This is a kind of maybe more equitable space, more closed, still confrontational in a sense, but everybody's in the same space. There's no opposition involved. And then we tried it completely fragmented in different configurations, tried to create different zones by looping the space continuously. Or different circles, so you could have autonomous spaces within the space. Or stacking it up to create maybe a slightly more hierarchical kind of arrangement. And alongside the sculpture, and with the same pacing, so basically every 2 weeks the sculpture was rearranged, and every 2 weeks there was a new broadsheet published. There were 6 broadsheets, and they dealt with these 6 paradoxes. So the 6 paradoxes are presentation and representation, affinity and disagreement. I always forget some of them. People and things, materiality and immateriality, city and urbanization, and I think I'm missing one. Maybe we'll get to it. So it's called affinity and disagreement, and I'll give you an example. I'm not going to go through all of the broadsheets in this talk, but this is Abbas Akavan's piece. So every broadsheet is an artwork and a text, and they don't relate to each other explicitly. Usually the contributors knew who the artist was or who the writer was, but they're not, and they might even be in conversation, but they write different things. And so Kanishka Gunawardena wrote a piece about affinity and antagonism. And Abbas sent this beautiful piece, which is a message in a bottle Molotov cocktail. So I think it beautifully realizes the question that, so the basic argument here, which I'll get to in a second, I guess. Sorry, actually no, in a slightly different order. But with affinity and antagonism, or affinity and disagreement, I'm simply interested in the idea that public spaces only exist in the sense of a demonstration of a paradox when a group of people have a strong affinity with one another. That is, publicness is always about a kind of affinity, something that's shared. But at the same time, there's no public space without a disagreement. So the disagreement requires the presentation of the paradox. The presentation of the paradox, in a certain way, is the presentation of the disagreement itself. So you don't have public space without both affinity and disagreement together. But I'm going to start with presentation, representation. Is public space made by government or citizens? And we've kind of already gone over this, but one of the fundamental confusions about the concept of public space is whether it refers to spaces funded and built by an elected government or to spaces appropriated by citizens in order to contest government policies. This tension emerged with the rise of modern democracy, predicated as it is on the election of representatives through majority vote. In this form of democracy, citizens no longer speak in their own voices, but through others, and a gap opens between the people's demands and the motivations of government. Within this situation, public space emerges as a locus where people can present themselves in protest against the government. But at the same time, public spaces are always representational. So, and I think this is true of many things, but So public space is definitively a paradox of representation and presentation. And I'm going to show some early projects that I did that were trying to think about public space. And so the first one is an unofficial entry to the Dundas Square competition. Dundas Square was rebuilt, I think, in the late 90s. And I entered the competition and with the team that won, but I left their team just after the first stage of the competition because I disagreed with what they were doing. And I made a separate scheme, which was unofficial entry. So my interest, the reason we got into one of the reasons that we got into the second round was because we started to think about public space in relation to Richard Sennett's text, The Spaces of Democracy, which argues that public space has to combine two opposed qualities. One of them, so he looks at ancient Athens, and he looks at two essential spaces for the democracy of ancient Athens. And one of them is the agora, and the second is the pnyx. And the agora is a space of difference. It's a market space, it's a space of the courts, but it's a space that everybody can move through. It's a casual space where small conversations can happen amongst people. It's a space of difference and complexity. The pnyx is very different. It's a space where everyone who's in this space of government can hear and see each other. So the pnyx is a kind of machine for people to hear and see each other. Everybody to hear everybody else. So it's a space of focus. So one space is a space of difference, complexity. The other space is a space of focus and decision making. And public space needs these two sides. And so I was interested in the possibility of making a space of both focus and openness, kind of focus and porosity. And so I used this kind of topographic landscape, a sort of sloped space that would be centered, and actually, you can see it's sort of bermed at the street. There are steps at the street. It's a bit hard to see in this view, but at the edges, it's level to the sidewalk here. You can cross it, but it's bermed at the edges so that it blocks the sound from the streets. So it makes it quieter in the middle, and then it has a raised walkway with smaller gardens above. But I was interested in public square being a political space, so I think you can see that my definition of public space is a political definition of public space. Public space is a political space. A public space is a space of conflict. So already this idea of somehow the paradox is present in this scheme. And this comes a lot from, I don't know if you're familiar with Rosalind Deutsch, but she wrote a really amazing book called Evictions, which is a wonderful text about the relationship between art, architecture, and public space in the city. And a lot of these ideas about conflict come from that. But she's relying heavily on Chantal Mouffe and Henri Lefebvre and other theorists. But it's also a space for play. So this was the entry for the competition. And quite shortly afterwards, I made a sculpture called originally Spiral Space and then Model for a Public Space, which is based on the same kind of modeling technique. So I put a floor of plywood, kind of notional floor, filled the gallery with plywood, and then cut a spiral in it with this saw on a sled. It's kind of tied to this drum in the center of the room. So you just push the saw forward and it cuts a spiral. And then over a number of days, I built a structure out of that spiral. And part of the idea of the structure was to create a conversation space where we could discuss issues of public space. So I made this zine of readings about architecture's relation to a public realm. And we had 3 different conversations, the first of which was just in the construction site. And then when it was built, we had a conversation in the space itself. So this space is meant to embody 2 different characteristics. One is the focus, and the other is openness. But it's meant to be, it's inspired by my experiences at the Anarchist Free School in Toronto. I participated in an Anarchist Free School in the late 90s and early 2000s. And in the Anarchist Free School, everybody always sits in a circle. But there's a limit to how many people can sit in a circle and you feel intimate with them. And so this was a way of creating a kind of circular space which was intimate and could house more people. But of course, what it does is, as soon as you change the circle, you start to introduce hierarchies. So there are different kinds of hierarchies in this space. There are center-periphery hierarchies, and there are top like top and bottom hierarchies. And so I think what's interesting in this scheme is that they to some extent work against each other. So there's an equalizing effect. If you're at the top, you're at the periphery. If you're at the bottom, you're in the center. And so even though it's not totally horizontal, I'm nonetheless interested in the fact that it's a surface. It's like you're all sitting on the same surface. So I think the spiral is part of that. And yet it's completely open and transparent, so you can look through it. So I'm interested in these contradictory qualities of the space itself. The last thing I would say is that it's an infrastructure for public space, but it's deliberately contingent. It's a kind of scaffold. And so it's partly about the contingency of public space. I mean, this definition of the manifestation of a paradox has a kind of contingency about it. And so public space is something, if it's under threat, it's built in a somewhat contingent way. So I've made many versions of this, but last year I made a new version, which was called Circles Describing Spheres. And I made it for an anarchist art exhibition at Haverford College in Philadelphia called If I Can't Dance to It, I Don't Want to Be Part of Your Revolution, curated by Natalie Mustiata. And this is Louis Jacobs' album on the walls around it. But so it's simply 5 circles. And the circles have 4 legs. 2 of the legs are hinged legs, so it can, and all the legs are adjustable in height. So all of them have the same legs, actually, but they can be adjusted up or down, and they can also tilt. So it's inspired a little bit by an armillary sphere, which was a way that medieval and Renaissance astronomers tried to model the heavenly bodies using, I don't know if you've seen this thing, but it's kind of a way of modeling orbits. But they're completely detached. So in this particular case, they're concentric, but they don't need to be concentric. And so in this case, they're interlocking, and they can be configured in many different ways. And so part of the idea was to create a much more flexible object than this built in situ model for a public space that could be reconfigured in different ways according to different social demands. And so this piece obviously also made it just before Furnishing Positions. So Furnishing Positions comes out of this as well. So last year I made these 2 modular works. And in this case we had a set of conversations. I'm part of the editorial board of a journal called Scapegoat, Architecture, Landscape, Political Economy. And Marcin Kedzior, who's also on the board, and I organized a set of conversations about how to dismantle both subjectivities and the space of private property under neoliberalism. Because the show, I didn't really explain this, but there are different shows. So I mentioned the Anarchist show, but this is a show curated by Helena Reckitt, who used to be at the power plant, but now is in the UK at Goldsmiths. But she curated the show at OCAD University called Getting Rid of Ourselves. So she was very interested in the project of deconstructing subjectivity. So we made a set of walks and discussions that looked at the deconstruction, the construction of subjectivity and private property at the same time, and the possibility of their mutual dismantling. So the second paradox. One fundamental paradox of public space is that people assemble because they have something in common, but at the same time they're only compelled to do so because they disagree with others about something that affects their lives. Contemporary political theorists have argued that disagreement lies at the heart of any political assembly, while others have emphasized the importance of affinities that draw people together. If both these claims are true, then public space has to accommodate the complexities of both consensus and dissensus. So this is a project that I was involved in many years ago, almost 20 years ago, called the October Group Inflatable. But it was done in 1996 during Metro Days of Action, which was the largest organized protest against the Harris Conservative government in Ontario. And there were hundreds of thousands of people that were organized, mostly unions, to demonstrate against the government on October 25th and 26th, 96. And as a group of architects and artists, we decided that we needed to make something. We needed to somehow participate, and we felt like we could make something. And we made an inflatable structure that sits in front of Toronto City Hall. So Toronto City Hall has right in front of it, there's a large grate that exhausts the parking garage, and it's 300 feet long. It's a 300-foot long vent from the parking garage. And it just happens to be the main facade of City Hall. And so we built a structure that was inflated by this exhaust air, and it completely blocks the square, or it creates a kind of a wall to the public square of Nathan Phillips Square, which is the City Hall. And working with a number of architects like Barry Eisner, Kenneth Hayes, artists like Kika Thorne, architect Christy Pearson, we came up with this sentence: "Have mercy, I cry, for the city. To entrust the streets to the greed of developers and to give them alone the right to build is to reduce life to no more than solitary confinement." And the sentence is based on Mike Heron's song and Velimir Klebnikov's text. So there's two different pieces that are put together. But the idea was to protest against the destruction of public housing and any kind of subsidies for housing in Ontario by the Conservative government. And then this project came shortly afterwards. It's called Public Water Closet. And it's simply a portable toilet with a two-way mirror door. And the two-way mirror door means that when you're inside, it looks like you're just looking out. But when you're outside it, you have this mirrored reflection. And it was actually first done in Ottawa in a show that Luke and Sin were also a part of. But in Toronto, it was put at the corner of Queen and Spadina, which was a place where a lot of young youth, street youth, were wiping the windows of cars, squeegee kids, a lot of them from Quebec. And so it was put there as a way of kind of claiming their right to the city, providing a piece of infrastructure that would facilitate these practices. So there was a lot of contestation about them using washrooms of local businesses. And at the same time, the government of Ontario enacted the Safe Streets Act, which was a little bit in the tradition of Rudolph Giuliani's policing in New York City, where trying to crack down on minor offenses. So things like panhandling would be offenses that would be usually fined, but people were also incarcerated for panhandling and small minor offenses. And so basically it was a way of criminalizing poverty. And so it's, I think, a very typical method of neoliberal policing. And I think this piece is a way of instantiating a certain paradox about, both about surveillance and pleasure, I think is one of the key paradoxes. That there's a certain pleasure in being in this space and feeling like you can see the world, but also as a way of being protected from the surveillance of the police. This is a piece, I mean, I haven't shown all of my model for public spaces, but I've made a few of them. And so at a certain point, I realized that this perfect spiral was somehow too ideal. I showed you the first model for a public space, and then I made a piece called Model for a Public Space Speaker, where the spiral went up the outside and then down in the middle. So it was kind of like a crater or a speaker. And in it, you could get in anywhere, and you could go out anywhere. And it was partly made in response to the first one. Some people felt like they were trapped. The first one I showed you, when you go in there, it's kind of hard to get out of it. And so if you're in a conversation you don't like, it's a big job to get out. So in the second one, I decided to make it really porous. You go up, over, anywhere. But it seemed like almost too ideal, almost like I had neutralized anything powerful in the structure. And so this one says, no, actually, you can't make a public space. Model for a public space not. It tries to negate the concept. But at the same time, it's about not so much not in the sense of no or not possible, but in the sense of the complexity of conversations, the knottedness of conversations, or their difficulty. Actually, this is a class by a couple of my scapegoat collaborators, Etienne Turpin and Adam Babette, who were teaching their undergraduate seminar in this space. But this is the poster, this is the invitation to the exhibition. And so it's a kind of research poster that shows different ideas that I was thinking about in making this space. And I guess I'd thought about all along as I was making these spaces earlier on. But trying to think about the complexities of discourse. And so rather than thinking of this circle as a perfect non-hierarchical environment for conversation, rather thinking about circles as multiple and as intertwined and disconnected and more complex. So you can also see how circles describing spheres and furnishing positions are also coming out of this project, Not, which tries to make more complex the perfect amphitheater that I was kind of making in earlier versions. And Christine Shaw and I organized 2 conversations about the relationship between contemporary art and politics and love. So love and politics in contemporary art. And so there were 2 conversations, and they tried to also present a kind of paradox. So the first one is, love is the motive force of every emancipatory politics. And we used to quote, we were thinking of a kind of, I guess, Deleuzian conception of connection. Connection as a key, and really following Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's discussion of love and politics. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they say what we're looking for and what counts in love is the production of subjectivity and the encounter of singularities, which compose new assemblages and constitute new forms of the common. So then they have a whole discourse, a very interesting one, about can love untie the knot of the identitarian politics of the family and the nation, etc. And the second one deals with a more Lacanian and maybe Badiouian conception of love. Love is an event ignited by the distance between 2 polarities. And to quote Jacques Lacan, love comes to compensate for the lack of a sexual connection. As parallel yet separate discourses, what common features do love and politics share? What is produced in the mismatch or missed appointment between the singular desires of individuals and communities? How are both intimate and political relations inevitably tied to the complex interactions between 2 bodies? So this conversation will focus on the productive contradictions, antagonisms, and antinomies that underlie relations of politics and love. And so this is one of the performances that was done by Alessandra Renzi and Laura Kane. So, paradox 3. The public sphere is always tightly tied to dominant ideologies, which in turn delimit what is possible and what is not, what is real and what is pure fantasy. As a result, many people and positions are excluded from public space. Political theorists such as Nancy Fraser and Michael Warner have argued that under these conditions we need multiple publics, or what they call counterpublics, conversations within which smaller groups of people can build arguments, gestures, and practices in opposition to the dominant culture and at a distance from it. It is only through the preservation of certain forms of privacy that we can have meaningful forms of public space. So here I think that every public space requires the corollary of private space, not simply as in order to define it, but in order to develop the ideas that might constitute the paradox. And so you might find sometimes, I have these 6 paradoxes. Sometimes my work fits better or worse into these. And obviously, I think the individual projects often fit into multiple paradoxes. So I'm not claiming there's any one-to-one relationship. And this one, maybe I was struggling a bit more to fit it in. But this is a set of photographs of artist studios in a building that I lived in the late 90s. And it was demolished in 2000. So it's called Evicted May 1st, 2009, Hannah Avenue. So this is the view from my window at the Gardner Expressway and the CNE, and then this is the demolition of the building. And these photographs are all done with pinhole cameras. So the pinhole cameras are put on the ceiling, and there's film put on 5 of the 6 sides of the box, and the image is projected onto the 5 sides through one single aperture. And so it produces, so part of the idea is that the camera is actually a model of the space. So the camera is a scale model of the room that it photographs, so that the walls are projected onto the sides of the box and the floor is projected onto the roof of the box, and the aperture is on the bottom of the box. And one of the things I like about it is that there's a very different kind of perspective on the floor and on the walls. So the walls are anamorphically projected, that is, they're obliquely projected, and the floor is directly projected, as a normal pinhole camera would be. But it means that things kind of accelerate off the walls. If they're actually on the walls, like in this image, can I do this? I don't seem to be able to do this, but over there are two paintings on the walls by Roy Mia, who's a graphic designer. The paintings seem to be quite represented, actually quite accurately in their locations on the wall. But anything that's in front of the wall, like the desk that projects off of it, is anamorphically distorted as it's pulled away from the surface of projection. But I'm interested in the identical nature of the box and the extreme diversity of the spaces. And so for me, it's a way of thinking about these spaces, which are very generic spaces, but which are inhabited in completely different ways. And so I really think it's kind of a portrait of a very utopian space in the city that's disappearing. So these industrial spaces are very hard to find in Toronto anymore because of the expense and the redevelopment and gentrification of the downtown. So that was my space. This is the building superintendent's space, and he was harvesting all the copper pipes out of the building. And so if you look down in the bottom right-hand image, there's actually a pipe cutter and all the copper pipes piling up. He was selling them as scrap while we were still living there. This is John Redekop, who's a sculptor, and he stored all his materials up high. You could see a table saw on the floor to give scale, but these elements up near the camera get much larger. This is Darrin O'Donnell's space. Darrin O'Donnell is quite a well-known kind of relational practitioner. Haircuts for Children is his best-known work, probably. And then this is forgetting his name. This is Baloche, or there. Yeah, I forgot. But he had this artist had a bathtub made from a slaughterhouse wheelbarrow. But you can see these lofts on the walls, and then this was his workspace where he was welding. And this is Gord Anderson's space. Gord Anderson's a painter, and Peter Boyer, who's a Toronto-based sculptor. Okay. So city urbanization. Architectural historian Pierre Vittorio Aureli claims that the ancient Greek city-state, the polis, predates politics, and that politics was born in the city. Today, many people argue that the city, at least as it was defined before the 20th century, no longer exists. Instead of discrete cities with defined boundaries, we have a continuous and planetary process of urbanization. However, even this process involves public space, insofar as the infrastructures that facilitate this sprawl are public goods. This voracious and expanding system of organization is not primarily political, but economic, and as a result, its public spaces are apolitical, and thus unable to offer a locus for rational resistance to the expansionary and destructive logic of development. So this is kind of maybe the most architectural of the different paradoxes. But I guess I'm working from Pierre Vittorio Aureli's book, The Possibility of an Absolute Architecture, where he posits a difference between the Greek polis and the Roman urbs. He says the Greek polis was a bounded space. So the wall of the city created a kind of bounded space in which politics could happen. So for him, politics needs a kind of boundary, needs a form. And so the polis, and the city, is for him a way of thinking about urban things as political. The urbs is based on the notion of the camp. So the Roman urbs, the model of the Roman urbs, is the military camp. And it's something that can be moved across territories, set up very quickly. It's essential to the logic of empire. So there's a very different logic, obviously, to the Roman Empire and the Greek city-state. But there's also a different idea about the city/urbanization. They have very different conceptions. So what O'Reilly argues is that capitalism is essentially a process of urbanization, and that's why cities have disappeared. That's why we don't have cities. We have just this kind of continuous process. So I'm also riffing a little bit on Neil Brenner's recent work. Neil Brenner, Christian Schmidt, and many other geographers who are thinking about the concept of planetary urbanization, where they argue that, following Henri Lefebvre, that the world is fully urbanized right now, not because more than 50% of people live in cities, but because the logic of production itself is predicated on the process of urbanization. And so they say urbanization has two kind of vectors. It has an explosion, implosion, these two vectors. It explodes outwards, and so Neil Brenner would say there are extreme territories of urbanization, like the Arctic, like the center of the Pacific, the deserts. All of these things are fully urbanized in terms of them being claimed as standing reserves of resources for urbanization. But there are also imploded spaces of urbanization, which would be the large megacities of the world. So urbanization isn't something like a city, it's a process, a dynamic process that covers the planet. But so public space requires us to think about the two things together. So for Pierre Vittorio O'Reilly, the idea is to make some kind of a space that can instantiate the polis within the expansionary logic of urbanization. And I think public space is always that too. It's always kind of the demonstration of a certain kind of space, location, within that infinite process of urbanization. And I was going to talk about this project. Calculus of Forms is a project I did with Jane Hutton. And it's a set of models of different public housing sites in different cities. So there are 7 models, and there are 3 in Toronto, 1 in Detroit, and 3 in Chicago. And so the way this room is set up is you can see 7 kind of shelving units in the room, and each shelving unit has 3 shelves. The low shelf is before there was public housing. The middle shelf is a model of public housing, and the top shelf is the model of after public housing, the erasure of public housing. So the longer title of this is actually Calculus of Forms, Building and Erasing Utopias. So it's thinking about the history of the 20th century and the idea, for an architect, I think this is really important, that architecture could somehow serve a broader public. It could be somehow used to equalize the inequalities of the city. And so public housing was built as a kind of utopian project. And we put up this this diagram, which might be well known at this point. It wasn't as well known when we did this show, but it's in this text by Gérard Duménil and Dominique Lévy, but it's actually derived from Piketty's work. Piketty, who wrote Capital in the 21st Century recently. But what's interesting about it is it's equalized for 1950. So in 1950, everything meets. So it's an arbitrary map, but it shows income disparity. And so it shows, okay, this is, it's hard to read this, 90 to 100, 99 to 100, 90 to 99, and 0 to 90. And then we get minus and plus. So basically what it shows is that at the turn of the 20th century, this is 1900, there was a large economic disparity between the top 1 percentile of the population and the rest of the population. But due to processes of Fordist Keynesianism, there was an equalization. But what happened under neoliberalism was a further bifurcation. So if you look at the period from, you can't see these numbers, but this is 1950 to 1980, you have a relative period of equalization, and then things really start to diverge. And so what we were interested in, when we built these shelves, the ground is 1900, and every centimeter is a year. And so the shelves are made to represent different times. And they're meant to intersect with that. So what we're interested in is the way in which public housing is always built in this middle period of relative equalization. And its destruction is part of the neoliberal project of social and economic polarization that I showed earlier. So the room was laid out with these different city maps and different location maps. So we look at the whole Great Lakes area, we locate the cities, and then we put the plans of the 3 cities, and then we locate the projects in relation to the city. So this is Robert Taylor Homes in Detroit. This is the model of Robert Taylor Homes. This is Henry Horner Homes. Henry Horner Homes in Chicago. This is Henry Horner Homes. This is Cabrini Green in Chicago. This is Cabrini Green. This is Jeffries Homes in Detroit. This is Jeffries Homes in Detroit on the map. And then in Toronto, we looked at Alexandra Park, Regent Park, and Lawrence Heights, 3 important public housing projects. So the models are, they're digitally printed, but they show the fabrics at these different times. And so this all seems very like kind of architectural urban project in a way. But we showed it at G Gallery, which is the Guelph University Gallery in Toronto. And maybe we were misguided, but we really felt that this was an aesthetic project about form. It's about the changing forms and the relationship between form, politics, and economics. And so when you look at like the housing before, this is Alexandra Park before. So it's a small scale Victorian houses. And then, so I'm jumping around a bit, but you can see in here, before you have farmland, then you have Lawrence Heights, and then you have much denser housing after. Or here at Robert Taylor Homes, you have workers' housing and industry replaced by these slabs. These slabs, this is a 2.4 mile long model. And I don't know if anybody drove into Chicago in the late 1990s, but when you come in from the south, you would pass 2.5 miles of slabs, public housing slabs, on your way in. It was a very iconic project. But they've all been demolished and there's hardly anything left. So you can see that the form of the city is radically different in each case. And they represent something that I think is very interesting. So sorry, this is Alexandra Park before public housing, this is the public housing, and this is the post-public housing. And so one of the key findings and differences is that in the United States, there's a much clearer, complete erasure. So when you look at, let's look at this one. This is Robert Taylor Homes. So you see the fabric before, then you see the slabs, and then you see almost nothing. And partly it just is taking a long time, but also the buildings that are replacing public housing are much smaller. Because in the US, there's a real paranoia about public housing. So it's erased and it's built as small houses. In Canada, in Toronto anyway, it's built at much higher densities actually. And that's partly about the fact that in Canada, they want to replace all the existing housing on site. So you end up with densities that are many times the original density of the public housing, because you want to add in, you want to mix this. The ideology today is to mix the housing so that there's market housing and public housing together. So in Canada, you have much higher densities. In the United States, you have much lower densities. But in both cases, you're erasing the idea of public housing. And in the United States, for sure, you're erasing it, period. And in Canada, at least, you're not building anything new. If you're very lucky, you're maintaining units in public housing. So I should probably speed up, right? We're at an hour here. I'm getting close to being done. I'll go quickly. So paradox 5, people and things. A public is always thought of as a group of people, but public spaces are not human. And they include not simply inanimate materials with their specific histories, but many non-human forms of life. Bruno Latour has argued that this split between people and things is the foundational ruse of modernity and is responsible for many of our current social and environmental problems. What would happen if we included non-human actors in our understanding of politics and in our public spaces? I don't want to talk about this too much, but this is from Bruno Latour's We Have Never Been Modern. And, and it's a key diagram that really just talks about the thesis of the book, which is that modernism, the ruse of modernity is the separation of humans and culture from non-humans in nature, or the social and political from the natural and the scientific. So modernism separates these two things. But what it does by separating them is it creates a wonderful world, a crazy world of monsters and hybrids. That is, strange connections between them underneath. So there's an apparent separation. There's a governmental, formal separation. But there's actually an incredible proliferation of intersections between these categories. And so this is why he argues for a ding politics, or a politics of things, to integrate things in our political questions. So this is another project that Jane Hutton and I did at the Jardin des Métis. And it's called Dymaxion Sleep. It's based on Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion map, but it's also inspired by his concept of Dymaxion Sleep, which was about polyphasic sleep, where you can sleep for a few minutes at a number of times during the day, and you can get through the day more efficiently that way. So you can sleep much less. If you sleep like 30 minutes every 6 hours, you can survive rather than having to sleep for 6 hours. So we decided to make a napping space at Jardin des Métis. And the idea about the space is that it's a set of nets, and the nets cover over an aromatic garden. So the garden is made of many different plants which have wonderful smells. So many mints, sage, citruses, fennel. And we made a kind of map of these things so that different parts of the garden would have different smells. And these are the different layers. And this is the garden on the opening day, so the plants are very small. And then here it is also early, and here it is the next year where it's much higher. So we were trying to include, obviously, many public spaces include non-human elements, but here there was an attempt to kind of bring humans and non-human elements into close proximity. Create a different topology of public space. And this is a project called Tricycle Market that I made for the Chengdu Biennial in 2011. And it works with vendors, street vendors. And the biennial was in a recently gentrified area of the city, an old industrial area that was turned into a music park. And so the idea was to bring vendors into the space in order to provide food for people who went to the biennial. But immediately there were health concerns, and the authorities decided that it couldn't be food. But they did allow it to proceed, and but it was only allowed to be installed on the second day, because for the opening it couldn't be there, because the officials didn't want to see vendors in the biennial grounds. And so it was also, I think, a bit like Public Water Closet, an attempt to create an infrastructure which was somehow prohibited by municipal regulations. So in fact, in Chengdu, even though there are many street vendors, street vending is illegal there. And so this project is a kind of networking of these different carts by creating a kind of canopy between them. And so we ended up with people mostly not selling food. You could sell drinks, but not cooked food. Okay, so this is the last paradox. For Habermas, the public sphere that emerged in the 18th century was a space that was both physical in the streets, coffee houses, and social clubs, and virtual, that is, embedded in media such as newspapers and journals. Today's media are even less material, as the internet allows anyone with access to a computer to produce and disseminate his or her ideas on the web. However, this process remains highly contested, and the proliferation of digital information means that every individual statement has less value than it once did. The most recent social movements emerged through and occupied complex hybrids of immaterial and material public spaces. And so I'm going to talk about a different kind of immateriality. This is a project that uses words and singing and anthems as a kind of immaterial dimension in relation to material public spaces. It's a collaboration that I did with Public Studio this summer. Public Studio is Elle Flanders and Tamira Sawatsky. They're an interesting Toronto collective. who focus on public space, as you can tell from their name. And this project is called Migrant Choir. And we did it in collaboration with Cittadini del Mondo, which was a migrant rights organization in Ferrara that Tamira happened to know. And so we were invited by the power plant to do a roundtable at the Creative Time Summit, which happens, I don't know if you're familiar with Creative Time, it's a New York-based arts organization that thinks about critical interventions in public space and social practice and political art. And so a number of Canadians were invited, and we were invited to collaborate on a roundtable. And we decided that the issue that we could come together around was the issue of borders. I'd been working a lot on Shenzhen, the city of Shenzhen, as a kind of border city in China, and they'd worked a lot on Israel and Palestine and the border there. But then as soon as we started thinking about going to Venice this summer, we realized that we had to think more about the borders of Europe. And so we decided to work with this organization, Cittadini del Mondo, to make a choir consisting of recent immigrants to Italy who were working with this migrant rights organization, and have them sing the anthems of different nations at the Venice Biennale. And so we decided, after thinking about it for quite a while, that they would sing at the Italian pavilion, the French pavilion, and the British pavilion. And we thought about that largely in relation to processes of colonization. And so we were thinking about the anthems as the moment of nation building, and the way in which the moment of nation building is also the moment of colonization. I've been really inspired by a book by Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nielsen called The Border as Method, or The Multiplication of Labor. And in it, they make a really interesting argument, I think an important argument, about capitalism being formed by three different kinds of lines. So the world had to be redrawn for capitalism. They talk about the emergence of the title Fabrica Mundi on different early modern maps. And the idea that the modern world had to be literally redrawn. And in its redrawing, there were three kinds of lines. The first kind of line is the line of the nation state itself. So the Peace of Westphalia produced the modern nation states. And you needed to bound the nation in order to have modernity. But as soon as you bound the nation, you need to be able to expand somewhere. And so Europe defined its boundaries, but outside its boundaries were free territory, uncharted territory that could then be colonized. So the colonies were produced co-constitutively with the nation state. Then the third kind of line is through the enclosures was the partition of private property within the nation state. So there's both the nation state, lines inside the nation, and lines outside the nation that had to be produced all at the same time. And it's very hard, if you look at the historical trajectory of these things, to say which came first. They're all sort of co-constitutively produced. So we were interested in the anthem as a kind of story about the nation, but also a story about colonization. And many of the anthems, of course, also talk about colonization in different ways. Like the Italian anthem talks about Scipio's helmet. And Scipio was a Roman general who defeated Hannibal and took over North Africa. And so, within the song, there's already this idea about the colonization of Africa by Italy. And of course, Italy did colonize many parts of Africa, and many of the parts of Africa from which migrants moved this summer. So if you look at North Africa and the Middle East, they were primarily colonized by these three countries, by France, Britain, and Italy. And so we were interested in retracing that. And so this is the Italian pavilion. And the migrants themselves, actually, in this case, we're hearing a lot about Syrian refugees, but the migrants that we were working with, and even at that time in the summer, the migrants that were coming from North Africa by boat to Italy and landing in Italy were still primarily from Africa. They weren't as much Syrian migrants at that point. So this is the first pavilion, and maybe the least powerful of them, because the Italian pavilion is such a strange architectural thing. So we were also, of course, interested in the biennial as a product of colonialism and nation building. And So here's the walk over, but this I especially like here, where we're walking up the main axis of the Giardini. And this is a project by Rax Media Collective. These statues with their heads cut off, or they're truncated all in different ways, but they march along this axis that leads up to the British Pavilion. And so if you think about the Giardini, it's completely structured around the power of Britain, and Britain as the kind of having a high point looking down across this axis to the entrance. And so here we're walking up that axis and then performing in front of the French Pavilion, and Cittadini del Mondo choreographed this, which was very interesting. They wrote a statement, and every time the anthem was sung, first there was a statement read as to why it was being sung in this place. And then the choir turned around and sang the anthem. And here we had to be very careful of the moving trees were a constant obstacle in this case. And then here at the British Pavilion, setting up, and then the performance with Sarah Lucas's big phallus in the background. So we had there was a round table at Creative Time, and a couple of the migrants came and participated in the round table. And many of the people that came asked, how do you feel singing these anthems in these places? And they were like, this is entirely affirmative. It wasn't an ironic project. It was a project of affirmation, affirming their right, in a sense, to be a part of this nation that they weren't a part of necessarily. I mean, maybe in Italy they were, but many of them had aspirations to go to these other nations, to go to France and Great Britain. And the other reason we picked those countries is that in Calais and at I think Ventimiglia, at the border conditions of both France and the UK, there were camps in Italy and then in France. And so there was a kind of vector that many of these migrants wanted to take through those countries. Okay. So I just want to show one last project. This is called Mirror Circles for Bajin. And I did it this fall. Yan Wu is a Toronto and China-based curator who curated an exhibition called Subtle Gestures in Shanghai. And this project is installed a block away from the residence of Bajin. And before I knew it was going to be installed there, I wanted to make something a bit like my Circles Describing Spheres project, which was done originally for an anarchist exhibition. And I'd been thinking a lot about the anarchist history of China. In the early 20th century, anarchism was an extremely powerful oppositional ideology. In fact, much stronger than communism in the teens of the 20th century. And only in the 1920s is there sort of an ideological battle between anarchism and communism that communism definitively wins. But as a result, Chinese communism is heavily influenced by anarchist political philosophy, especially Mao himself. And the whole idea of one of the particularities of Chinese communism is the rural quality, the peasant revolution, which is something that was very difficult to argue for from a communist, strictly doctrinaire communist point of view. And it reflects the insertion of anarchist philosophy. And so Bajin, who lived for many years in Shanghai, is an extremely interesting character because he was a very famous novelist, but he was also the best known anarchist writer of the 20th century in China. And after the revolution, he kind of converted, became a communist. But then every time there was a movement against intellectuals, he would get persecuted. They'd drag out all his anarchist writings. They'd explain why he was a bourgeois capitalist dog, and they would persecute him. So he was persecuted very heavily in '57, and then he was persecuted throughout the Cultural Revolution. His wife died during the Cultural Revolution as a result of persecution. And so this is one of his first novels, The Family, and this is his last famous work, which is called Random Thoughts, and it's a reflection on the Cultural Revolution and his own persecution during the Cultural Revolution. And so I wanted to make this piece called, that I decided, I would have made this piece anyway, called something else, but I decided it should be called Mirrored Circles for Bajin to kind of commemorate him. And it's essentially just 6 circles cut out of a 1/2-inch plate of stainless steel that are polished, and they're put at different heights and different locations. So the smallest one hangs on this pergola where they hang bird cages in the park. And then there's a picnic table And then if you look on the right, there's one that circles a tree. And then there's one that's folded up. And so one of the simple reason why they're reflective, there are, I guess, two reasons. One, I guess it resonates a little bit with Robert Smithson's idea of the mirror as a way of kind of fragmenting the image, trying to break apart the image of the park, to collage things together. Bajin's first book is actually called Destruction. So there's a certain dimension of anarchism trying to transform society, break society apart. But also, Bajin is famous for his reflections in his novels, in his writing about anarchism, but especially in his self-reflection. So every time you got persecuted, every time that you got persecuted in China, of course, you had to write your own self-reflections. You had to write a self-criticism. And he had to write them over and over again. He was a writer who was being criticized. So his job was to write ad infinitum his own criticism. And then when he got out, when he was freed, when he was rehabilitated in 1978, he decided to keep going. So he wrote Random Thoughts as a free self-reflection. So he'd done all these kind of coerced self-reflections, and then he got to do a free self-reflection. And so there's a kind of idea about reflection here that I think is interesting. This is the didactic panel. I don't have a good picture of it, but on it I quoted Bajin a couple times. And one of them is a description of his house. And he says, I used to wander in my backyard all the time, and I found lots of beautiful plants, some of them medicinal, but I never found one single poisonous weed. And poisonous weed was the word that was used to describe his writing during these moments of persecution. So in '57, and then from 1966 to 1976, his entire oeuvre was called A Poisonous Weed. But he says this, I think, to think about the diversity of thought, the importance of diverse thoughts, and the impossibility of thoughts being poisonous weeds. They're ideas. Ideas are not poisonous weeds. And so I also make a little description about his anarchism in here. And we had an opening. Yan edited my text a little bit to make sure it wasn't too inflammatory. It was put on this didactic panel. And 2 weeks after the opening, someone complained about the work. And they complained about the work to the municipal planning authority, actually to the district planning authority. And the district planning authority was always a little bit unsure about this whole exhibition. And they immediately were like, this is crazy. They complained about its anarchism. They complained about the quote. They complained about the fact that it had the words free association in it. And they were going to tear everything. They were going to remove the sculpture. And the higher level planning authority thought it wasn't a good idea to remove the sculpture, and so they removed the didactic panel. And they refused the distribution. They censored the distribution of the pamphlet, which describes all the works in the show. So somehow this piece, despite the fact that all this work is like Wikipedia available in Chinese Wikipedia, putting them together in the work was somehow not acceptable. So maybe I'll just end there. Sorry, I was a bit long. Yeah. If anyone has any questions, I can answer questions.
I have a question for you. Hi. And I'm happy to translate. I'll do my best if anybody else has a question. But it's really interesting in your work how you have this coexistence of, you call the broadsheets, or the didactic panel, and then and it's interesting because as artist myself, I always have that urge, that desire to have some sort of that political discourse to accompany the work. So how do you see the two? It's difficult. I mean, obviously here it was interesting that it was the two of them together that caused the friction in the installation.
It's true. Like a bunch of mirrored circles aren't going to inflame anybody.
No, but like you said, it was putting the two of them together that caused this, even though his work is readily available on the computer and that sort of thing. So how do you see this, that the two aspects of your work, the broadsheets and then the physical work, are the two always are the two L's necessary? Or sometimes do you omit the kind of the more didactic or the written work to just have the sculptural piece? Or how do you see the two? Are they always necessary together, or are they?
No, it's a really good question. I think usually, I like to insist on something. I guess I like to inhabit the things. I think the things themselves are very open. So this is different, I think. So this is a slightly different move. This is more about titling, right? I think that the broadsheet is different in that, and it's similar to other strategies, like in the first version of Spiral Space, I made a zine to talk about public space. So I think that the sculpture has complete autonomy. I mean, especially in the title, Spiral Space, or even Model for Public Space. It's a very empty title, in a way. But nonetheless, it has a form, and the form has certain social meanings and constructs relationships between people in very specific ways. But then I wanted to test it by inhabiting it in a certain way, a more polemical way. And so the text was like that. And I think the broadsheet and the sculpture work in the same way. The sculpture itself, Furnishing Positions, is also very empty, in a sense.
Except when they're inhabited, then they must.
Yeah, exactly.
It must become evident the relationships that you're trying to create in these public spaces. Once they're inhabited by people, which they seem to always be.
Yeah. Well, they're often not, of course. I show them filled up with people, but they're often just, when you come to the gallery, you often see them empty. But yeah, I think I'm just trying to inhabit them once. Like there's a kind of very small sliver of time that the sculpture is there that I am going to do my best to inhabit the thing with an idea, with a set of ideas. And the rest of the time, other things inhabit it.
And so I guess that's also where the written work helps to, like you say, inhabit the piece.
Yeah.
It helps to give that context or that reflection when you can't have that physical relationship with other people in the space to create that interaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in this case, I think it's really the naming. And of course, then there's a description. I mean, I then am elaborating on the name and why I thought the name was appropriate. But yeah, it was actually reinstalled directly after this show in a new show in Shanghai. So it's up in Shanghai right now, but we had to change the title in order to reinstall it. So it's called Mirror Circles for One or More Workers, because it's in a kind of a workers' housing district. But I mean, I don't know. Is that ethical, or I don't know if that was a good.
How do you feel? How do you feel about that, working in China and being told not to do that and do that and don't call it like that? And is it challenging? Is it frustrating? What is? I don't.
I mean, I think I breathe. I mean, I don't know. I hope I can go back to China because I'm very invested in research there. So I don't really. I hope that I'm not on some list or something like that. I don't know why I would be, but I variously could be, of course, right? It's very. I think that right now China is very. There's been a bit of a turn, I think, with Xi Jinping, and the current administration is much more repressive about free speech. It's a much more. I mean, it's very hard on corruption, which is good. But alongside that, there's a cracking down on a lot of different things. And I think it's a lot less open than it was 5 years ago. So I guess in a certain way, I'm happy that the work is able to affect people, that it has an effect, that it's actually a little bit. I mean, despite the fact that everybody knows that Ba-Jin was an anarchist, it's like public knowledge. Don't say it. If you say it, then you're pushing a button. And I think that the anarchist history of China is extremely interesting. I mean, it lingers and it has a presence, and I think it's important to talk about that because I think it's kind of, for me, a hopeful presence. Like that the legacy of anarchism I see as a positive dimension, even though, I mean, it's really perverted. Like also the Cultural Revolution, the whole idea of Cultural Revolution, a lot of people argue, is an anarchist idea. It's not an economic revolution, it's a cultural revolution. and anarchists are interested in the transformation of everyday life, in a sense. But of course, it's totally perverted. I mean, the actual Cultural Revolution had nothing to do with anarchist principles. It was implemented in a very different way. But it had elements of it, too. So I think it's important to talk about that. I mean, I think for me, it's an important political project to start to think more about that. Because, and not many people are doing it. I mean, there are good books on it. Like R.F. Derlich wrote a great book about it, and there are a couple of others. That were written more in 80s and 90s about anarchism in China. So there has been scholarship in China and outside it about anarchism in China. But I think it's a very interesting, kind of lingering dimension that affected the whole 20th century and is a hopeful dimension of Chinese communism. So I think, yeah, I'm excited by the fact that, I mean, that has an effect. I mean, it's sad. Yeah, it's really sad that I think the current government is more repressive. Yeah. But I mean, I guess I was also surprised because I've been going there for many years, and it seemed like the cultural space was somewhat bracketed. I mean, I know Ai Weiwei gets in a lot of trouble, but he also pushes a lot of buttons. I mean, he's a really high-profile person pushing a lot of buttons. But most artists don't seem to be censured that much, but not anymore. Or,
Est-ce que quelqu'un d'autre peut faire un commentaire ou poser une question?
Your cycle pieces, different variation of cycle pieces, have been presented in galleries mainly. I mean, except this one, of course. But I'm wondering how you would imagine their potential implementation in the spaces of public authority. Do you see them as kind of diagrams of what is public space, or do you see them as also potential
by cycle,
apparatus?
you mean
I mean the model for public space,
yeah.
or the...
I thought you meant because we've talked a lot about these projects with bicycles. I thought you were talking about those, yeah.
But the furnishing position, the cycle describing spheres, and they are mainly kind of variation on the same model. But do you see them as, because they were presented in a very gallery? Do you see them as kind of diagrams, or as kind of potential apparatus for the outside world that would be, for example, potential long-term intervention in the city, or because?
I mean, I think when I first made them, I was insistent on their contingency. You know, that they were like scaffolds, or like Christine Shaw, my Furnishing Positions, had a kind of semi-autonomous relationship to an exhibition called False Works. And I don't know if you know the word false work in English, but it's like form work for concrete, but false work is like the shoring that holds up a building or something. It's like a temporary structure. So she called the entire show False Works. But I really thought that these early projects were like false works. They were like temporary constructions which reflected the necessary contingency of a public space in the capitalist world. But I think, you know, the mirror circles for Bajin, if they wanted to keep it, I think it would be great. I mean, it's a very permanent kind of material, and it could last a long time. So I think there might be ways to do it, yeah. But I think I agree there's a tension. There's a certain tension, because I think your point about the diagram is very important. It is a diagram. I mean, the word model is meant in that sense. They're models, they're like contingent models for public space. And so, but maybe contingency is a relative term. You know, could be a number of years, I don't know.